For episode 21, Sakura School is going to have a marathon. So the story begins in the schoolyard. Of course, everyone's there. Chelsea, Nikki, Rita, Madison, who unfortunately had hurt her leg, so she's unable to attend the marathon. But we have Lee, Sakura, and Meilin that they are attending. So Chelsea, who was concerned with Madison's leg, and asked if it would be all right. So even though Madison told her friends not to worry that her leg would be better within a week, and here comes Sakura. And guess what she's doing? She's busy running laps. But she's not the only one because everybody else is doing it. And I'm not sure who said it, but she made a compliment to say, gee, Sakura's quite a runner. I'm sure she'll win the marathon again this year. But then Maylin's voice out of nowhere says, I don't think so. So Chelsea, Nikki, and Rita were looking at Meilin, who approached them. They made Lynn please her case to tell them why, because she said, and I quote, that both herself and Lee will be taking first and second place this year. That's why. Then Mei Lin explains how she and Lee were competitors back in the day in their old school and etc. So speaking of which, back with Sakura, she's still busy racing Lee. Until when the teacher saw them both running at once, he says, wow, looks like Sakura has a competition on her hands, and he's not kidding. So now that Lee and Sakura were finished racing, that's when Meilin speaks in her case to her cousin to say, we're going to win this race for sure this year. And so Sakura was asking, you and Lee were racing in marathons too? Well, of course I am, and so is Lee, Meilin said. Then Meilin told Sakura, I'm here to warn you to stay out of my way. So Lee has his turn to ask a question. Have you ever ran in a long distance marathon before? Well, since it's Meilin's first time, it doesn't mean that she shouldn't try. So she decided to go ahead and give it her all. In a race, of course. Well, just before the race could begin, that's when the teacher explains the rules. He says, pay attention. All the students must run 5 laps. And make sure you pace yourselves. And then all the students agreed. So the race was on, just in time, just to be exact. Well, Meilin was doing well for the first lap so far, and of course Lee and the others just couldn't believe it. Then Meilin did well for the second lap, then the third lap, and then the fourth one, until finally on the fifth lap, Zachary won. Unfortunately for Meilin, she didn't do so well on the fifth lap. She's gotten so exhausted at that, and so she decided to rest for a while. So now that the two girls had finished running, that's when Sakura wanted to know from Meilin if she's going to be alright because she doesn't look so good. Well, I didn't feel well the first time I started either, Meilin said. Then Meilin pleaded her case to say that not once has she ever lost a race to anybody, well, except to Lee, of course. Then Lee has his turn to plead his case to Meilin to say, well, that's true, but you have never run more than 100 yards either in this race. Then he said, think about it. Running a 100-meter dash is a lot different than a marathon itself. Then Meilin has her turn to plead her case to say it doesn't matter what you thought of it. It's still running to me. So later that night at the Avalon residence, it was just after dinner that Sakura was helping her father and Tori's father, Aiden, to do dishes. The first thing Sakura did was to thank her father for making dinner that night. No problem, Aiden said. So just to be curious, Aiden, who's Tori and Sakura's father, wanted to know from her, so you're running the marathon this Friday, right? That's right, Sakura said. Then Aiden has asked Sakura, you did win a race last year, did you? I sure did, Sakura said. Now Tori, who's Sakura's brother, although curious, wants to know what time is the race. She says around 3:30, when the school ended. Well, Sakura's brother made a suggestion. He says, well, if I'm not too busy that Friday, maybe I could come around and watch it. And Sakura says, wow, thanks. So Sakura wants to know from her brother, you work at the ice cream shop, right? Actually, no, Sakura's brother Tori said. I work at the grocery store now. So Sakura's brother Tori wants to know, well, where is it? Well, Sakura said when she explains that first of all they're going to run a lap at school. Then they go by Penguin Park. And then from Penguin Park to Cherry Tree Street. Then we go past the library, which is right across the bridge from Penguin Park, Sakura explains. Then finally, Sakura explains, we go across the bridge to Penguin Park and then right back at the schoolyard. So Tori says, wow, that's a lot of running. Well, it seems that way, Sakura said. But since I enjoyed it so much, I had no idea. I never even noticed. Then Tori makes his case to say, well, on the other hand, you have been training for it all morning. Of course, Tori wasn't exactly kidding when he said that. So, meanwhile, at Lee's apartment upstairs, we see Lee having dinner with his cousin Meilin, and it was Wang Wei who was more than happy to serve dinner to them. The first thing Meilin did was to thank everyone for dinner, and so she was about to leave from the dining room. So Lee says, where are you going? And she says, well, I want to train for the marathon. Well, Lee just pleaded his case to ask his cousin a question. Why can't you just give it up? What are you talking about? Meilin asked. All I did was have a bad day at the race, that's all. Besides, I can handle it, Meilin says. Then Wayne Wei has his turn to warn Meilin to say, it's not very smart to run after eating. Why not? Meilin asked. Well, for one thing, you could get a stomach cramp, Wayne Wei said. But Meilin just kind of scoffs at it and then dismisses it and tells him, I'll be just fine, don't worry about it. And so she heads off. So later at Penguin Park, so by the time that Meilin had arrived at Penguin Park, you can tell that she's not feeling so well. Well, Wing Wei tried to warn her about running right after eating, but she chose to ignore him. She chose to not listen to him. Well, now she wished she had. So by the time that Wayne Wei had found her alone at Penguin Park, and oh, by the way, he brought a blanket for her. So he says, here, you'll catch a death of cold. So she said, this is for a breathing method? And he says, well, that's right. So if I were you, I'd run a little slower for the next day, he said. Although as supportive as Wayne Wade can be, that's when he told Meilin, you should save some energy for the finish line. And when you do, that's when you can give it your all. Thanks for the advice, Meilin said to Wayne. I'll give it my best shot. Well, it was Lee who should you be thanking for, Wayne said. Then Wayne had pleaded his case to say to Meilin that since Lee had felt so bad for her since she didn't do so well, he felt that maybe she can use some encouragement and support that she needs. So, Meilin, after following Wayne's advice, she went ahead and did some training for the marathon that was taking place at the school the very next day by running across the bridge, of course. So, when the day finally came with the race that following afternoon at Sakura School, in the schoolyard, of course, so while everybody else was finished practicing, that's when Meilin approached Sakura, who was talking to Chelsea and Nikki. So Meilin says, hey, Sakura, I'm here to warn you. I'm training for this marathon all night long with the best trainer there is. So I don't think you have a chance to catch up with me. So after Meilin heads off, that's when Nikki says, wow, I guess she's going to have a competition on her hands. And she's not kidding. Because, as Nikki says in her case, she's very competitive. So, Sakura just heard the voice of her brother's best friend Julian calling her name. So when Sakura looks over her shoulder to look at both her brother and her brother's best friend, she went up to approach them. So the first thing that Julian did was to wish Sakura luck on her race that day. Why, thank you very much, Sakura said. So the voice on the PA says, will all runners report to the starting line immediately? So before Sakura can head off to the starting line, that's when Julian says, don't worry, Tori and I will be there to cheer you on. I appreciate every support there is, Sakura says, and so she heads off. So her brother says, "Oh, by the way, don't get clumsy out there." So back with the runners, they're all lining up on the starting line, and of course, taping it on her camcorder as usual is Sakura's best friend, Madison, who unfortunately is unable to attend, but that doesn't mean she should record it, in which she's doing it. Oh, hey, let's not forget about Kiro. He's watching the race from up above with his telescope, of course. So Kiro just lets Madison know that the marathon is all set up and it's ready to go. So back at the schoolyard, the race was about to begin. So with the sound of the gun, that's when the runners started running off. So just like the way it's planned, Sakura, Meilin, and Sakura did their lap around the schoolyard. So they had left from the school, and so they're on their way to Penguin Park. And of course, watching it from up above is Kiro, and he can tell that Sakura's fallen behind Lee and Meilin, that is. So speaking of which, back with the trio, they just passed by Maggie at the Twin Bells shop on the way to Penguin Park. Well, good news for the trio, Meilin, Lee, and Sakura. They have finally arrived at Penguin Park just the way it's planned. So far, everything in the marathon was going well, and there were no problems, or so they thought. So back with Julian and Tori, who had just left Sakura's school moments ago, they have arrived at Cherry Tree Street, just the way it's planned. So Julian wants to know from Tori, has Sakura and the others had arrived yet? No, I don't think so, Tori said. Meanwhile, Madison, who was Sakura's best friend, had also arrived at Cherry Tree Street. She was asking Kiro what's going on up there. Well, Kiro just told Madison the good news that the trio is heading towards Cherry Tree Street right this minute. And of course, Sakura's still far behind Lee and Meilin to be exact. Well, good news for the trio. They had just arrived at Cherry Tree Street and went right by Madison, who's Sakura's best friend. Also passing by Madison were the rest of the runners that just left from Sakura School earlier as well. So back with Kiro, who was watching the race from above through his telescope, of course, but he couldn't see a thing because there was a bunch of trees everywhere. So back with Meilin, Lee, and Sakura, they were just about to run towards Julian and Tori, who was about to meet them there. So back with the trio, they were getting closer and closer to Julian and Tori. That's when Julian cheers on Sakura to say, "Come on, you can do it." So after the trio just passed by Julian and Tori, and then Tori pleaded his case to say, "You know what I think? I think they're going too fast at a pace like this." "I think you're right," Julian says, who happens to agree with him. Back with Madison, who's Sakura's best friend, and she just saw Nikki, who was passing her by. So back with Julian and Tori, who just saw Nikki, one of Sakura's friends, passing them by, that's when Tori made a suggestion with his best friend that they should meet up with the others, and Julian agrees. So back at Cherry Tree Street with Madison, who's Sakura's best friend, Madison doesn't know it yet, but she sensed that something was off. And that's when here comes Lee, Sakura, and Madison, who just passed her by for the second time. Madison doesn't know it yet, but something weird is going on, but she's not sure of it. So back with Lee, Sakura, and Meilin, who had just passed Madison by for the second time, she wants to know if there was something weird going on. Not only did Lee say that he did feel something weird, but Meilin wasn't so sure. So she says, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" Well, of course, when she said in her case that they should have passed by the others by now, but they didn't. Then Meilin has her turn to speak in her case to say maybe the others are too slow. I doubt that was possible, Sakura says. They couldn't be too far behind. So back with Kiro, who had just arrived at Penguin Park, he thought he saw Sakura, but instead he saw Zachary, and he and the rest of the group are heading back towards the schoolyard. And that's when he heard a transmission from Madison, who's Sakura's best friend. She says, "I don't get it. They just passed by me twice, and they haven't made it back to the schoolyard yet." Then Kira wants to know from Madison, do you suppose they have gotten lost? No, I don't think so, Madison said. When they passed me by twice, they were running in the same direction. So what Madison's telling Carol that she sensed that something was off for some unknown reason, but she wasn't sure of it. So back with the trio, Sakura, Lee, and Meilin, who for the third time had just passed by Sakura's best friend Madison, that's when Meilin started getting tired, and then she finally collapsed. If things weren't bad enough, Meilin had told her cousin Lee that she had hurt her ankle. So when Lee and Sakura approached Meilin, Sakura said, "Are you okay?" Then Sakura just heard the voice of her best friend, Madison, that's calling her name. So Sakura was asking Madison, "What's going on?" "Well," Madison says, "I know this sounds crazy, but didn't you just pass me by twice already?" Lee just told his cousin G your ankle was hurting pretty bad. "I'm fine," Meilin said. Then Sakura made a suggestion. "Maybe we should wait for the teacher to arrive to give you a ride on his bicycle." "I don't think so," Meilin says. "I'm going to cross that finish line one way or another." "No, you really are hurt," Lee says. Then Sakura made a suggestion. "I know. Why don't we have Mr. Torada come to help us?" "Well, I just saw him just moments ago," Madison says. "He's on his way back to the schoolyard right now." "Well, that's true," Sakura said, "but Mr. Torada was supposed to be behind us until the last kid arrives at school." "Well, that's true too," Madison says, "because just moments ago she just saw Nikki that was passing her by and she was already there." Then Sakura pleaded her case to say, "If you're thinking that I'm thinking, then something is definitely wrong. Something was off." Then Lee said, "I agree. Take a look at this poster over here." "You're right," Sakura says. "We had passed by that poster twice." "That's right," Madison said. "And you passed me by twice in the same direction." Because Madison happens to agree with Lee and Sakura. "There's something weird going on," Madison said. Then Lee and Sakura looked at each other and said, "Well, we should have known from the start right then that, yep, it is definitely a you know what." So that explains why the three of them were running in the exact same direction. So now all they have to do is find out what that card is and why it's doing it. And here comes the tricky part, where to find it and how to find it. So Lee tells Sakura, "If I'm not mistaken, it's somewhere nearby." "I agree," Sakura said. So anyway, Madison knows what to do. She gives Sakura a cell phone. And it was then that Carol just gave Sakura the bad news that the reason why they were running in the same direction is definitely a loop card. And Sakura, when she heard that, she says, "What? Did you say loop?" "That's right," Carol says, and he explains why. And then he also explains how the loop card works. "Well, if that's true," Sakura says, "then why couldn't I see it?" "Well, the reason why you couldn't see it," Carol explains, "is because the only way you could see it is if you untie it somehow." "Then that means we could never find it anywhere," Sakura said. Then Lee says, "Leave it to me. I know how I could find it." "And how, you may ask?" "Well, luckily for him, he brought his lesson board along." So Meilin says, "Hey, that's not a bad idea." So Lee does what he knows best. He uses lesson board to find out where the loop card is located at. Back with Sakura, who is talking to Kiro, that's when Kiro says, "You have to steal the card quick before he does." "But how?" Sakura asks. "Well, look around," Kiro says. "There's gotta be a line somewhere in this street. That explains why it's so connected." Then Kiro says, "Listen, if you can disconnect the loop somehow, then that means you can cut it." So in other words, what Kiro means to say to Sakura that there's gotta be an unusual place somewhere. Then Madison, after Sakura asks him, "But how am I supposed to find that?" "Well, maybe I can help with that," Madison said. So that's exactly what Sakura and Madison did, but before long, that's when Sakura realizes there's a strange red line that's dividing the street in half. So once Sakura found a big, huge red line that's all over Cherry Tree Street, that's dividing the street in half and is so connected. So we know what this means. Good news, Sakura found the loop card. So Kiro, after hearing the good news from Sakura, he says now all you have to do is just cut the loop. And by how, you may ask? Well, Sakura knows what to do. She has to use the sword card. At the same time, Lee will use his own sword. So that's what they both did. Both Lee and Sakura had both cut the loop in half with their swords. And when they did, the loops card appeared out of nowhere. So it's now up to Sakura to seal it, and which she did. So the loop card makes it number 21 on Sakura's list. So when Meilin saw that the loop card was caught thanks to Sakura, and she says, "Hey, no fair! Lee could have had that." Well, that may be true, but not this time. So, in other words, Lee still has two cards on his list. So back at the schoolyard, the first person to make it back at school was Nikki. And of course, watching it happen were Tori and his best friend Julian, and they were getting extremely worried. So Julian told Tori Sakura and the others should have been back by now. Then Tori, who agrees with his best friend, he asked a question. What if Sakura and the others got lost or something? Back on Cherry Tree Street, Meilin, who refused to have any help, especially from her cousin Lee, he says, "Oh, come on, there's no way you can walk with an ankle like this." "I got a suggestion," Madison said. "I'll stay here while Lee and Sakura can get you a doctor." "Good idea," Sakura said. But Meilin declined and says, "No way, I come too far. You know I trained this hard to get to the marathon." So after Lee had felt so bad for Meilin, he has a suggestion. He says, "Here, hop on my back." And she says, "Really?" "Yeah, we can all go back to school together." So that's what all of them did. Sakura, Madison, Lee, and Meilin went back at the schoolyard now that everybody else has made it back. And that's when Lee, Sakura, and Meilin were the last ones to be back, including Madison, who's Sakura's best friend. Of course, as always, she has it all on her video camera, just like any friend would do. And of course, the first thing that Meilin did is now that everybody's made it back, she hugs Lee and says, "Oh, thank you so much." Then Meilin speaks in her case to say, "Well, I gotta give credit to you. Had I not have hurt my ankle, I would have won by now. And just for your information to make it clear, that loop car still belongs to Lee in my case." "Oh, and one more thing," Meilin says. "Watch your step next time, because Lee and I are going to capture these carts, and you won't." Well, you know what this means. That means, in Sakura's case, that means there's got to be a lot of competition on her hands more than that. So even though she may not win the race that day, I guess you could say it's a three-way tie. So that means, in Sakura's case, that means there's still a lot of cards to catch. So that ends episode 21.